This is a story about something my father witnessed as a child in northern Texas. He was born and raised on his family's farm until he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. In that part of the country, most of your neighbors' farms could be more than 5 miles away, but the spirit of community meant that all you had to do was ask for help, and you would get it without a second thought. However, there was an exception to that rule. The two landowners to the north of his family's farm had been at war since, as some said, the Civil War. One farmer had been a loyal Democrat and slave owner, while the other was supposedly the head of a newly arrived Yankee family who supported Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party. The Yankees were also wealthy and had purchased a large plot of land that the other farmer had coveted for some time. Like so many other families at that time and in that part of Texas, what began as a political disagreement worsened with the arrival of the war. When that bloody conflict ended and both men returned from fighting, the neighbors hoped that the differences between them would be resolved, but that was not to be. The resentment that had always simmered just beneath the surface flared up again after a dispute over the property line arose. Josiah Campbell, the patriarch of the pro-unionist Campbell family, had purchased a plot of 200 acres just before the war broke out. This large plot bordered his neighbor's property to the east, Samuel Johnson's, but it wasn't until 1883, when Campbell began installing fences to prevent his neighbor's cattle from invading his land, that the already hostile relationship between the two landowners reached a dangerous boiling point. Several face-to-face confrontations eventually led to a legal battle in which Campbell was victorious. If Campbell thought that the court ruling would end the dispute between the two families, he was terribly mistaken. Many more disagreements arose, some over trivial matters, in the generations that followed. One of the most notable incidents involved Josiah, now an octogenarian grandfather, when a stray bullet nearly hit him. Although most in the area assumed that Samuel or one of his sons had fired the bullet, it could never be proven. Similar incidents only served to keep the bad blood between the families simmering just hot enough. My family's involvement in this drama is small. Economically and politically, our situation was similar to that of the Johnsons, a native Southern family who had come to Texas during the Republican period from Tennessee. However, that's where the similarities ended. According to what has been passed down through the generations, Samuel Johnson and most of his descendants were ignorant and always looking for a fight. One particular story says that my great-great-grandfather even stopped attending church because of them. His attempts to stay out of all this mess were well thought out, at least until a quiet morning in 1962, when they were dragged into it, whether they liked it or not. It was a warm June morning. My dad and his family went to church as usual. Everything was normal that day except for the conspicuous absence of the Campbell family. The section where they had been sitting since the church was built was strikingly empty. Because of this, murmurs quickly spread among the congregation. The Johnsons were sitting quietly in their own section, doing their best to ignore the comments around them. The Reverend waited, but eventually had to proceed with the service. On the way back home, the family passed by the Campbell farm, expecting to see the usual activity of daily work and the people involved in it. However, no one was to be seen, and the house was still, with no signs of life inside. My grandfather dropped the women off at the house, and he and my dad went back to the Campbell farm to take a closer look. As they approached the house, the unsettling silence was broken by the slamming of the screen door. It had been left open and free to move with the wind. The noise attracted the animals, and their incessant mooing showed that they still hadn't been fed or milked. If that was true, something had to be very wrong. My dad ran to the barn, fed the animals quickly, and rejoined his father at the door. They were able to enter without a problem. Leaving doors unlocked was still common practice in that area, but that would soon change. There were no signs of life in the back of the house. My grandfather called out but got no response. If anyone were still alive inside, the creaking of the stairs as they climbed certainly would have made them move, but no one appeared. The two men split up when they reached the landing, each heading to different closed doors. By chance, my father was the first to discover the fate of the Campbell family. Two small bodies lay motionless in their small beds, soaked in blood. John Jr. and William had been shot multiple times while they slept. Upon seeing this, my father ran out of the room, struggling to hold back the urge to vomit. He was still just a child and had never witnessed anything so horrible. His father was about to enter the Campbell parents' bedroom when his son came running out of the other room. Though no words were exchanged between them, my grandfather knew what horrors likely awaited in the room behind him. The scene in the parents' bedroom was very similar to that of the children. Both of the elderly Campbells lay motionless and bloodied in their large Victorian bed. Both had been shot in the head with a shotgun, but John Campbell, the patriarch, had been shot several more times to the point that it was impossible to identify him with certainty. Despite this, there was no doubt that the gruesomely murdered man was John Campbell, and the man behind the shotgun was his lifelong adversary, Matthew Johnson. Matthew's absence that morning at the service was almost as notable as that of the Campbells. The search for the man didn't last long. Matthew's body was found hanging in the barn loft, and it was clear that he had taken his own life. The motive behind such a horrific act was, more than likely, the latest in a long series of legal battles. This time, the Campbells had found it necessary to take Matthew to another long and complicated case over water rights, along the long-disputed property line they shared. After more than 3 years of fighting, the Johnsons finally lost. What would have been just another link in the chain that had connected the two farming dynasties for over 100 years turned out to be the end of the Johnson family's hold over their land. It was later discovered that they had barely managed to stay afloat from harvest to harvest, and John Campbell's lawsuit, along with their eventual loss, was the final blow. Once Matthew had nothing left to lose, the century-old bitterness between the neighboring families boiled over, giving him the justification that many of his predecessors hadn't had. His family told the sheriff that Tasha, Matthew's wife, claimed her husband had left just after sunset and returned 2 hours later with a considerable amount of blood on his shirt. She watched from her bedroom window as he burned those same clothes. After finishing, he went to bed and slept as if nothing had happened. However, the next morning, when she woke up, Matthew was no longer in bed beside her. She searched the farm but didn't find him. The family went to church as usual because they feared that their absence would cause gossip. She swore she had no idea what her husband had planned to do when he left that night, or what he had done when he came back. It was clear he had done something dark, but the target was unknown. The remaining members of the Johnson family held an auction of their few valuable possessions and left the property shortly after. My dad said it was rumored that they lived in Wichita Falls and that Tasha, Matthew's wife, had remarried. But when he went to war, he never heard anything about them again. The property of their old farm and the adjacent lands were purchased by a large company from Fort Worth, which divided the land into smaller plots and sold them to new buyers. As for the Campbell land, the farm remained vacant for many years. The slaughter that took place inside tainted the value of a house that otherwise would have been beautiful. That land, too, would inevitably be divided and become a large housing subdivision in the area, and all the remaining family farms were absorbed by the nearby city. I lived in a big city with my wife and son, and I worked a corporate job at a bank. Ever since my son was born, I wanted to move to a quieter place, but it was very difficult to leave my job. I had requested a transfer every year for a long time, but nothing ever materialized until my son was 11 years old. The scary thing was that when it happened very quickly. From the moment we received the news, we had only 2 months to move. At first, my son Miguel was angry, as most kids would be, but he got over it. The transfer came with a promotion and a good raise, so money wasn't an issue for the move. We had lived in an apartment before, but we moved to a nice house in the suburbs. The place was perfect for our family and the neighborhood seemed pretty good. It was a single-story ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and 3 bedrooms. The house also had a large basement that we were going to let Miguel use as a playroom. The move happened during Miguel's summer vacation, which was convenient because he wouldn't have to miss school. He would also have time to settle in before it started. The neighborhood was very quiet, and it seemed like most of the people there were older and retired, but there was one family on our block with a child around my son's age. We saw him playing basketball alone one day, and Miguel was with me in the car, and I saw that he noticed him too. The boy looked lonely playing by himself, so it seemed obvious that he and Miguel should be friends. Later that week, I introduced myself to the people who lived in that house. They were very nice and invited me in to chat. I went inside and sent a text to my wife to come over. They offered me a drink and we talked in the living room. When I mentioned that our kids should be friends, they seemed very excited. I'm sure they had been hoping for another kid to move into the neighborhood. My wife couldn't come over, but I got to meet the boy. His name was Tadeo, and at first, he seemed shy. That's not unusual for a kid meeting an adult, so I didn't think much of it. We set up a playdate for them, and at first everything went pretty well. Miguel is quite outgoing, very different from Tadeo, but he hadn't made many friends yet. They started spending a lot of time together, mostly playing Nintendo in our basement or riding their bikes around the neighborhood. It was nice to see Miguel making a new friend so quickly after the move, and I hoped it would help Tadeo come out of his shell. Everything seemed to be going well, and I felt like we were settling into the new place smoothly. After a few weeks, Miguel seemed less enthusiastic about spending time with Tadeo. He didn't say much about it, just that he didn't want to play with him anymore. I asked if something had happened, but Miguel didn't want to give any details. I respected his decision and didn't press him for more. Sometimes kids just drift apart or find other interests. I figured if there was a real problem, Miguel would tell me. Meanwhile, Tadeo kept coming over occasionally, but Miguel would usually come up with some excuse to do something else. It seemed like a typical phase kids go through, and I didn't think much of it. Life went on as usual. I was doing well in my new job, and as far as I knew, everything was fine. One afternoon, I came home from work and found some graffiti on the side of our house. It wasn't anything major, just some scribbles, but it was ugly. Our neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where there was any sort of crime. There hadn't been a single case of theft or anything like that since we'd been living there, and we had already been there for almost 5 months at that point. I suspected it might have been Tadeo, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. The next day, I decided to clean it up and let it go. However, a few days later, I noticed some scratches near the lock on the back door. It looked like someone had tried to break in. I asked Miguel if he had seen anything unusual, but he hadn't noticed anything. That's when I started to worry. I installed a security camera as a precaution, hoping it would deter further incidents. A few nights later, I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw someone lurking around our backyard. It was hard to see because they didn't come too close to the house. It looked like a young boy around Tadeo and Miguel's age. I looked at the footage closely, and after that, I really thought it was Tadeo. I showed it to his parents, but when they saw it, they were sure it wasn't him. In a way, I don't blame them for defending their son. Without much else to go on, I let the matter drop. The only thing I could have done was call the police, but without definitive proof, I didn't think it made much sense. However, that night, I was in the living room talking to my wife about the situation when suddenly Miguel came into the room, looking nervous. He sat down on the couch next to me and said he wanted to explain why he had stopped being friends with Tadeo. Miguel told us a series of disturbing things that Tadeo had done while they were friends. He said that one day, when they were playing in the woods, Tadeo took him to a spot where there was a dead raccoon. Tadeo started playing with the corpse with his bare hands and was using it like a puppet. Miguel got scared and ran away. He also told us that on another occasion when they were hanging out, Tadeo pulled out a knife. It was a kitchen knife that Miguel didn't recognize, but Tadeo had it hidden when he came over to our house. Tadeo held it to Miguel's neck and said he wanted to know what it felt like. That was the incident that really ended their friendship. When Miguel broke off their friendship, Tadeo told him that he would kill him if he told anyone. That's why he hadn't said anything before. Things were much worse than I had imagined. It was starting to seem like Tadeo was a complete psychopath. A few days after we caught him on our security camera, I came home and found the back door ajar. My heart sank as I rushed inside. In the living room, I found Tadeo holding one of the small knives from our kitchen. He was standing a few feet away from Miguel. Miguel looked scared, but he wasn't hurt. I moved quickly and told Tadeo to drop the knife. As soon as he saw me, I could tell Tadeo was scared. He dropped the knife and started laughing. It was a very manic laugh, but I think he was really trying to pretend that it was all a joke. Maybe he thought if we believed it was just a big prank, he could avoid the consequences. I called the police and his parents while the two boys stayed in our kitchen. Even though I was on the phone, I never took my eyes off Tadeo. After that, his parents took the matter more seriously. I can't believe they didn't know something was going on with him, so they were probably just ignoring it. We only stayed in that neighborhood for another 6 months because Miguel begged us to move. Honestly, I didn't need much convincing and I probably would have done it anyway. It was too frightening to have that boy around all the time. He wanted to hurt our son, and I would never forgive myself if something had happened. A little over a year ago, I made one of the most important decisions of my life. I moved to Germany. I didn't do it for pleasure, although there was some excitement in it. I did it for work, seeking new opportunities, like many other people who look to Europe with hopes of professional growth and, in my case, with the intention of continuing my studies at some point. Germany, with its stable economy and vast job opportunities, seemed like the perfect place to fulfill those dreams. The decision to move was, without a doubt, exciting. There was something magical about the idea of starting over in a foreign country, far from everything I had known. But along with that excitement, there was a lingering fear that I didn't quite want to admit. Moving alone to a country where I barely spoke the language, where I didn't know anyone, was intimidating. Still, I've always been someone who adapts quickly to changes, or at least that's what I told myself every time the fear crept in. I found a small apartment in a quiet town on the outskirts of Munich. It wasn't a big metropolis like Berlin or Hamburg, but big enough to have all the amenities I needed. The neighborhood was full of families and older people, which made me feel safe from the start. At first, everything seemed to be in order. I would wake up early to go to work, return in the afternoon, and enjoy the peace the area offered. Everything was so predictable, so normal, that I couldn't imagine something dark might be lurking right next to me. My life in the neighborhood wasn't what you'd call very social. Although I saw my neighbors often, our interactions were limited to polite greetings when we passed each other in the elevator or hallway. I never formed close friendships, nor did I feel the need to. After all, between work and nightly calls with my family back home, I didn't have much time for socializing. Loneliness was a constant shadow, but I learned to live with it. I believe that was the price of starting fresh in a foreign country. It was about 6 months after my arrival when things began to change. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly, but over time that subtlety turned into something more unsettling. A man moved into the apartment right next to mine. His name was Bastian. He was a man in his 50s with a completely ordinary appearance. If you'd seen him on the street, you'd pass him by without a second thought. He always dressed formally, almost old-fashioned, which, considering he lived alone in a residential neighborhood, struck me as a bit odd from the start. He was tall and thin with graying hair and thick-framed glasses that gave him an even more aged appearance. Despite his somewhat stiff demeanor, I didn't find him intimidating at all. In fact, when I met him, he seemed friendly, even affable. The day he moved in, we greeted each other in the hallway. He smiled at me with that formal politeness you see in people of his generation, and from then on, we exchanged a few words whenever we ran into each other. At first, there was nothing unusual about Bastian. He was the kind of neighbor you'd expect to have in a quiet neighborhood like mine. But over time, I began to notice things that simply didn't add up. It all started with something as simple as noises. At night, when I was getting ready to sleep, I began hearing noises coming from Bastian's apartment. At first, they weren't particularly alarming. They were the kind of sounds you'd expect when a neighbor is doing small repairs in their home. Occasional hammering, the odd clank of tools. Nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself that Bastian was probably fixing up his apartment, which wasn't unusual in a building of that age. However, as the weeks passed, the noises didn't just continue, they became stranger. They were no longer just the typical sounds of someone doing repairs. Sometimes I heard what sounded like heavy objects being dragged across the floor, or muffled thuds that seemed to come from deep within the apartment. What really started to worry me was the fact that these noises didn't happen during the day, when you'd expect someone to be working on their home. No, the noises started late at night, sometimes past midnight, just when the whole neighborhood seemed to be in a deep silence. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it wasn't important, but as the noises grew more intense and persistent, they started to affect me. My sleep was interrupted night after night, and the unease inside me grew. What was Bastian doing at those hours of the night? Why was he working so late? After several sleepless nights, I decided I had to ask him directly. One day I ran into him in the hallway when we were both coming home from work. It was the perfect opportunity to mention the noises without seeming too intrusive. I approached him with a forced smile, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Hey, Bastian," I said, trying to hide my nervousness. "I've been hearing some noises from your apartment at night. Are you doing repairs or something like that?" Bastian smiled back at me, but there was something about his expression that I didn't quite like. His smile, though polite, seemed tense, forced, as if he were trying to hide something behind it. Still, he answered without hesitation. "Oh yes, I've been fixing a few things here and there. This place needs a bit of maintenance," he said, downplaying it. "Nothing serious, just a few repairs." Although his answers seemed reasonable, something inside me wasn't satisfied. I tried to let it go, but every night the noises continued and my doubts grew deeper. I started to think something wasn't right. What kind of repairs required so much work, and why at those hours of the night? Something didn't add up, but I had no proof that anything was really wrong, just that uncomfortable feeling growing inside me. Weeks later, Bastian hosted a small gathering at his apartment. He invited several neighbors, including me. At first I hesitated to go. There was something about his behavior that still unsettled me, but I thought maybe I was overreacting. Besides, it would be an opportunity to get to know the neighbors better, and perhaps finally see what Bastian's apartment looked like, which might help resolve some of my doubts. The day of the gathering arrived, and although I felt nervous, I decided to attend. Bastian greeted me with his usual polite smile, and the atmosphere in his apartment seemed surprisingly normal. The living room was full of neighbors chatting cheerfully, and the place was decorated simply but warmly. Nothing in the apartment seemed out of the ordinary, which put me at ease a little. The conversation flowed, and I started to relax. However, almost at the end of the evening, when I was starting to think my worries were unfounded, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. I asked Bastian where it was, and he pointed down a hallway at the back of his apartment. As I walked toward the bathroom, something caught my attention. I passed a door that was slightly ajar, and I saw something strange inside. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but on my way back from the bathroom, curiosity got the better of me. I stopped in front of the door to take a closer look. What I saw inside that room left me paralyzed. The interior of the room was a shrine, but not a religious shrine or something that could be considered normal. On the walls hung dozens of framed photos, all of a little girl. At first I thought they might be pictures of a daughter or niece, but as I looked closer, the air froze in my lungs. Those photos weren't of just any girl. They were pictures of me from when I was little. They were images from my childhood, memories I thought I had left behind in my home country. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. What truly filled me with terror were the dolls. Dozens of dolls, all perfectly lined up on shelves along the walls. And they weren't just any dolls. They were dolls I had owned when I was a child, toys I had left behind when I moved out of my house. How was that possible? How had Bastian gotten those objects? How did he know so much about me? My heart was racing and I felt cold sweat running down my forehead. A million questions flooded my mind, but none had answers. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise, but as I did, the door creaked slightly. The sound was enough to alert someone. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching down the hallway. My heart stopped for a second when I saw Bastian standing there, looking at me with the same polite smile as always. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, something dark and threatening. "Do you like the room?" he asked in a soft tone. But the intensity in his voice chilled me to the bone. I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were in chaos, and all I wanted at that moment was to get out of there as quickly as possible. I mumbled a vague excuse, something about having to leave soon, and made my way to the front door as calmly as I could pretend. Bastian didn't try to stop me, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me as I walked away. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed on the couch, trembling from head to toe. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photos, the dolls, and felt Bastian's gaze on me. How had he gotten those objects? Why did he have them? What was he planning with all this? The following days were a mix of fear and paranoia. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, and the more I thought about it, the more scared I felt. I decided to dig a little deeper into Bastian, although I didn't know where to start. Finally, after making several calls to my family, my mother revealed something I had never known. Bastian wasn't a stranger after all. It turns out that many years ago, Bastian had been my mother's boyfriend. They had dated when she was young, before I was born. The relationship had ended abruptly, and my mother never spoke of him. Somehow, Bastian had maintained an obsession with my mother throughout all those years, and now that obsession had transferred to me. He had been watching me since I moved in, and his invitation to his house hadn't been just a simple neighborly gesture. It had all been part of his plan to get closer to me. I don't know exactly what his intentions were, but it was clear they weren't good. As soon as I discovered the truth, I made the decision to move out as soon as possible. I couldn't stay in a place where my own neighbor had an unhealthy obsession with me. Even today, when I remember everything that happened, I'm filled with a sense of horror. I don't know what Bastian would have done if I hadn't discovered his secret in time, but I know nothing good would have come of it. That experience taught me that sometimes the most ordinary people can hide the darkest secrets. And while we may think we're safe in our own homes, the truth is we never know who might be watching us, waiting for their moment. This happened a long time ago, but I still remember it as if it had happened yesterday. There are experiences that, no matter how much you try to bury them deep in your memory, refuse to fade away. They're like invisible scars, always present, always lingering, tormenting you at the most unexpected moments. My name is Elsa, and what I'm about to share is the story of how I had to face the worst nightmare of any mother. Never in my life did I think something like this would happen to me. It's the kind of thing you hear about on the news, the misfortunes that happen to others, never to you. But the truth is that it did happen to me, and although it's still difficult to talk about, I know sharing my story is necessary. Perhaps by doing so I can help someone else be more alert, to avoid making the same mistakes I made, to not trust blindly as I did. I lived in a quiet neighborhood in Mexico, in a small house that took a lot of effort to buy. My daughter Sophia was 5 years old at the time, and she was the center of my universe, my greatest source of happiness. Like any mother, I did my best every day to give her the best I could, though being a single mother was never easy. My relationship with my parents, Sophia's grandparents, was complicated. We hardly spoke, and I was practically alone in raising my daughter. Even so, I don't complain. Sophia and I had a modest but happy life, and that was all that really mattered. In the neighborhood, there were a few neighbors with whom I had a cordial relationship. We greeted each other when we passed on the street, exchanged a few words now and then, but I never became close friends with any of them. However, there was one in particular who always made me feel strangely uncomfortable. Edgar. He was a man in his 40s, single, living alone in a house a few doors down from mine. At first glance, there was nothing particularly strange about him. He always dressed impeccably, with perfectly pressed clothes and a neat appearance that contrasted with his solitary lifestyle. Whenever he saw me, he greeted me politely, sometimes stopping to chat about trivial matters. At first, he didn't give me a bad feeling, but over time I began to notice something about his behavior that deeply unsettled me. It wasn't something I could pinpoint clearly. Maybe it was the way he looked at Sophia whenever we were in the yard. Or maybe it was his tendency to appear out of nowhere, as if he always found an excuse to pass by my house just when we were outside. Sometimes it was to ask something trivial, like if he needed sugar or if I knew what time the trash would be picked up. Other times he simply made comments about how cute Sophia was, how smart she seemed for her age, how well she played. At first I thought he was just a kind man, maybe lonely, who was simply seeking company. But as time went on, his constant attention toward my daughter began to worry me more than I could admit. I remember one day in particular, one of those sweltering summer afternoons, and I was in the yard watering the plants. Edgar appeared at the gate with his usual smile, but this time he was holding something in his hands. It was a small doll, one of those antique-looking ones with glass eyes and a lace dress. He said he had bought it because it reminded him of Sophia. I smiled politely and accepted the gift, though deep down something didn't feel right. Why would a single man with no children buy a doll for a little girl who wasn't his? Although logic screamed at me that something was off, I didn't ask any more questions. Maybe because as a mother, we always try to see the best in people, or maybe because I didn't want to face the possibility that someone so close could be a danger. The gesture, which at the time seemed harmless, was only the prelude to something much darker. Over time, Edgar began passing by my house more frequently. If he saw me outside with Sophia, he always found an excuse to stop. At first, they were innocent conversations, but then he started asking questions about her. He asked what she liked to do, what her favorite toys were, what time she went to school. His attention, which at first seemed kind, began to bother me. There was something about the way he looked at her that made me uncomfortable, a sort of obsession that I couldn't explain. Sometimes I caught him staring at her while she played, and when I noticed, he quickly looked away, as if he didn't want me to see him watching so closely. One day, while I was watering the plants as usual, Edgar approached the gate with a proposal that completely took me by surprise. He said, with his usual polite tone, that he'd like to take Sophia for a walk to the park, which was just a few blocks from the house. He said it so naturally that for a moment, I almost agreed. But at that instant, something inside me woke up. It wasn't just his offer. It was the tone in which he said it, the way his eyes fixated on my daughter with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. I politely thanked him, but told him I preferred to take her myself later. I noticed how his smile faltered for a second, how a shadow of annoyance crossed his face before he recovered his usual friendly expression. He didn't insist, but from that day on, my instincts screamed that something wasn't right with Edgar. After that incident, I started paying more attention to his movements. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, I began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. Sometimes I saw him passing by my house several times during the day, as if he were watching. There was one occasion when I came back from the grocery store and found him standing right in front of my door, as if he were waiting for someone. When he saw me, he made up some excuse. Something about having lost something on the street, but by then my suspicions were more than planted. Every time I saw him, my discomfort grew, but at the same time I felt like I didn't have any concrete proof to confront him. What could I say? That the way he looked at my daughter made me uncomfortable? That his attention seemed excessive? They were just gut feelings. But my motherly instinct told me I needed to stay alert. The real horror happened on a Saturday afternoon, an afternoon I will never forget. That day had been completely normal. Or so I thought, until everything changed. Sophia was happily playing in the backyard while I was in the kitchen preparing lunch. I was at ease, thinking about how well we'd been doing lately, when suddenly the doorbell rang, breaking the calm of the afternoon. I walked to the door, not imagining what was about to happen. When I opened it, I found Edgar. His usual expression was there, but there was something else. Something in his gaze, a kind of nervousness he was trying to hide. It gave me a strange feeling, one I hadn't felt before. "Hello, Elsa, everything okay?" he asked with his usual smile, but I noticed his eyes kept darting toward the backyard, where Sophia was still playing. "Yes, everything's fine." "Do you need something?" I replied, hoping the conversation would be brief, wishing he would leave as soon as possible. "I was just passing by to say hello. I thought maybe Sophia would like me to show her a few tricks with the ball I bought her the other day," he said, tilting his head toward where my daughter was joyfully chasing a ball. His tone was casual, but I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the first time he had mentioned my daughter so casually, but this time there was something different. There was an intensity in his voice, in the way he watched her, that made me feel a deep fear, a fear I had been able to ignore until that moment. Something wasn't right, and I knew it in that instant. My maternal instinct, which had been dormant for so long, finally awoke fully. I knew I had to act, but before I could think of what to do, Edgar pushed the door with a strength I hadn't imagined he had. In a matter of seconds, he was already inside my house. Fear paralyzed me for a moment. I didn't understand what was happening. What had once been just a suspicion now materialized into a terrifying reality. The polite, solitary man I had known for so many years no longer existed. In his place was someone else. Someone with a dark and twisted look. Someone who seemed on the verge of losing control. "You don't understand, Elsa. All of this is for her. You can't keep us apart," he said in a trembling voice, but one filled with a contained fury I had never seen in him before. At that moment, everything became clear. Edgar wasn't just innocently interested in Sophia. He didn't simply want to play with her or be her friend. His intentions were much darker, much more dangerous. The fear I felt at that moment was like an electric shock running through my entire body. I couldn't let him hurt my daughter. I couldn't let his twisted obsessions become a reality. Without thinking, I screamed with all my might, "Sophia, run, run!" My voice broke in the air, but it was enough for my daughter, who until that moment had been unaware of what was happening, to realize something was wrong. Sophia looked at me with frightened eyes, her little face full of confusion, but without saying a word, she began to run toward the back door. Edgar tried to stop her, but I stepped between them, pushing him with all my strength. When my dad and I moved into the small apartment, it was supposed to be a temporary solution while our house was being renovated. We were adjusting to our new environment in the apartment complex, which was mostly quite peaceful. Most of our neighbors kept to themselves, and life was monotonous. except for one family who lived a couple of doors down from us. The family consisted of a mother and her 2 adult children, a son and a daughter, both in their 20s. From the moment we moved in, it became clear that their home was far from peaceful. It seemed that every other day their arguments spilled into the common areas of the complex. The son, a tall and muscular guy with a perpetually angry expression, and the sister, a petite woman with an equally fiery temper, were always at odds. The mother, a weary woman with dark circles under her eyes, usually tried to mediate, but her efforts were generally in vain. Despite the frequent disturbances, my dad and I tried to stay out of what didn't concern us. After all, we were only going to be there for a few months, and it didn't seem worth getting involved in someone else's family drama. But all of that changed one sunny afternoon when the arguments escalated into something much more dangerous. I remember that day very clearly. It was a quiet Saturday, and I was in my room trying to focus on a book I had been wanting to finish. My dad was in the living room tinkering with some electronic devices, his favorite hobby. The usual sounds of the apartment complex, distant conversations, footsteps, the hum of appliances, provided a comforting background noise. Suddenly, the familiar sound of yelling broke the calm. I sighed and tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another one of their routine arguments. But this time, the shouting was different. It was more urgent, more desperate. I put the book aside and went to the window, my curiosity getting the better of me. What I saw next chilled me to the bone. The mother and daughter were outside, backing away from the building with terrified expressions on their faces. The son was following them, his face twisted in rage, and in his hand he held a large kitchen knife. He was shouting something unintelligible, but his intentions were clear. "Dad!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. "Come quickly!" My dad ran to me and looked out the window. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Without a second's hesitation, he grabbed his phone and rushed out the door. I followed close behind, my heart racing in my chest. When we reached the path outside the building, the situation had escalated even further. The son was now only a few feet away from his mother and sister, who were cornered against the wall with nowhere to go. My dad, a man of action, wasted no time. He lunged at the son, grabbing his arm in an attempt to wrestle the knife away from him. "Call the police," he shouted over his shoulder. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. By then, my dad and the son were already in a full-on struggle, the knife glinting in the sunlight as they fought for control. The mother and daughter looked on in horror, too shocked to move. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "There's a man with a knife attacking his family. My dad is trying to stop him. We need help now." I responded quickly, giving our address as fast as I could. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I watched in terror as my dad managed to pin the son to the ground, finally prying the knife from his hands. Surprisingly, the son didn't resist much after that. He just lay there, breathing heavily while my dad yelled at him to stay still. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and several police cars screeched to a stop in front of the complex. Officers jumped out with their guns drawn and quickly took control of the situation. They handcuffed the son and took him away, still enraged but not resisting. The mother and daughter collapsed to the ground, sobbing with relief. My dad, his face pale and hands trembling, handed the knife to one of the officers. I stood there, still clutching my phone, feeling a mix of fear and admiration for my dad's bravery. One of the officers approached us and took our statements. The mother, once she had calmed down enough to speak, explained that her son had severe anger issues. She told us they had been struggling with it for years and that it wasn't the first time he had become violent. She expressed her gratitude to my dad for stepping in and possibly saving their lives. As the police took the son away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What if he came back? What if the situation got even worse next time? These thoughts swirled in my mind as we headed back to our apartment, the adrenaline slowly fading. In the days that followed, the apartment complex was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of life were replaced by an unsettling silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The mother and daughter kept to themselves, rarely leaving their apartment. About a month later, we noticed that the son had returned. He looked different, calmer, almost resigned. The mother had mentioned that he was receiving treatment, but it was hard to believe that a month away could bring such a drastic change. Surprisingly, there were no more arguments or fights. The family seemed to have found a fragile peace, and the complex slowly returned to its normal state. But the incident left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to be prepared for the unexpected. As for my dad and me, our bond grew stronger after that day. I had always admired him, but seeing him in action, risking his own safety to protect others, made me realize how lucky I was to have him. Our time in the apartment was temporary, but the lessons we learned and the experiences we shared during those months stayed with us forever. Eventually, the renovations on our house were completed, and it was time to move back home. As we packed up our belongings and prepared to leave the apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The apartment complex, which had once been just a temporary home, had become a place of growth and learning for me. I looked out the window one last time, taking in the familiar view of the path and the rows of connected houses. The memory of that fateful afternoon was still fresh in my mind, but now it was tempered with a sense of resilience and hope. Life was unpredictable, but with my dad by my side, I knew we could face any challenge that came our way. As we drove away from the complex, I glanced back with a small smile on my lips. It had been a place of chaos and fear, but also of courage and strength, and I knew that no matter where life took us next, I would carry those lessons with me, ready to face the future with new confidence and determination. For as long as I can remember, he was always there. He wasn't my father, nor did he pretend to be, but in some way he held a very special place in my life. My neighbor was a kind man, always present, always willing to help. To me, he was more than just a neighbor. He was like a close uncle, someone I could trust. I never saw him as a father because, although I never got to meet mine, the idea of a father was something sacred to me. My mother used to tell me that my father had disappeared when I was very young, too young to remember him, and that he never came back. Over time, I got used to that version of the story, and, although I always felt curious to know more, I accepted that perhaps that was the truth. At least it was the truth my mother gave me. We lived in a small terraced house in a modest town in England near the countryside, in one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. It wasn't a place that stood out for anything in particular, but for me it was home. Our house was on the corner of a quiet street, with a small garden in the front and a larger one in the back. From my window I could see the park where I played as a child, and I often spent afternoons there kicking a ball or running around with my friends. It wasn't a place that offered too many distractions, but back then I didn't need much more. My world revolved around school, friends, and daily life with my mother. And then there was him, my neighbor. Unlike other men his age, who always seemed busy with their jobs or their own families, he always had time for me. He was the kind of person who was always available to teach me something new, fix my bike when it broke, or just sit and chat with me about anything. I clearly remember how he taught me to fish when I was just 10 years old. It was a rainy day, but we didn't care. We were by the river laughing as he explained how to cast the line. I wasn't very good at it, and I accidentally snagged my line on a nearby branch. We laughed so much that day that I completely forgot my father wasn't there to share the moment with me. My mother and my neighbor also seemed to get along very well. In fact, their relationship was always close enough that sometimes it seemed strange to me, but I never questioned it. They talked a lot, always in the kitchen or the garden. Often when my mother was busy or stressed, he was there to offer a helping hand or assist with whatever we needed. It was as if he had always been a part of our lives, a constant presence that never seemed out of place. When I was younger, my mother would joke that he was like family. I always took it literally, without giving it much thought. But the truth is, from a very young age, I always felt the absence of my father like a shadow that never fully disappeared. Sometimes when my friends talked about their dads or I saw them playing together, I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. I wondered what kind of relationship we would have had if he had been around. My mother never talked much about him. Occasionally I'd ask a question, but her answers were always short and to the point. "He left when you were very young," she'd say. "He couldn't handle the responsibility." And that was it. There were never more details, never a deeper explanation. Over time, I stopped asking. The fact that my neighbor was so present in my life seemed in some way to make up for that absence. He was the man who helped me with my homework when my mother was too busy, the one who taught me to fix things or play soccer in the park, Although I never used the word father to describe him, he was the closest thing to a father figure I had. And for many years, that was enough. I never wondered if there was something more behind his kindness, something I wasn't seeing. To me, he was simply the man who lived next door and had taken an important role in my life. Everything changed the year I turned 16. I clearly remember that time in my life. It was a stage where I was starting to feel more independent. My friends and I were beginning to go out more, explore the city, and enjoy our newfound teenage freedom. My mother continued to work long hours, as she had always done, and I spent more time alone at home. I didn't mind. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I felt capable of taking care of myself. It was on a cold winter night when everything began to unravel. My mother had gone to work late, as she often did. I was home doing schoolwork in the kitchen. The silence of the house was almost comforting, and the warmth of the heater contrasted with the cold that seeped in through the windows. I was focused on my books when I heard a soft knock at the front door. It wasn't unusual for my neighbor to stop by to say hello or drop something off for my mother, so I wasn't surprised to see him there when I opened the door. He had a bottle of wine in his hand and told me he had come to drop something off for my mother, as he had done many times before. I invited him in, more out of habit than a desire for company, and we sat in the kitchen. There was nothing out of the ordinary at that moment. We chatted for a while, as we often did, but slowly, I noticed something in his demeanor had changed. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, but there was something in his gaze that unsettled me, something in his tone of voice that was different. The conversation, which at first had been casual and relaxed, began to take on a more serious, more tense tone. I could feel that he was about to tell me something important, something I might not want to hear. Finally, after a long silence, he looked me directly in the eyes and spoke the words that would change my life forever. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper. "Something your mother hasn't told you about your father." My stomach clenched instantly. I felt a sensation of vertigo, as if the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. What could he know about my father that I didn't? Why was he and not my mother about to reveal something so important? My mind began to race, searching for an explanation, a reason for why he was talking about my father, a figure who had been a mystery my entire life. "Your mother," he continued, his voice trembling. "Your father didn't leave because he couldn't handle the responsibility. He didn't leave of his own free will." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. My heart was pounding, and every second that passed without him completing the sentence felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like a century, he said it. "Your father took his own life, and he did it because of me." The words hit me like a slap. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind, accustomed to the version my mother had always told me, simply couldn't process what I had just heard. Everything I knew, everything I believed about my father's disappearance, had crumbled in a matter of seconds. At some point, between the shock and the confusion, he told me the whole story, each detail more painful than the last. Years ago, when I was just a baby, he and my mother had started a secret relationship. My father, who was already dealing with emotional problems, found out about the betrayal. Although he tried to move on, tried to save his marriage and family life, the betrayal was too much for him. Not long after, he fell into a deep depression, one that consumed him completely. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he decided to end his life. Hearing those words felt like a knife to the heart. The man I had admired for so many years, the man who had been a father figure to me, turned out to be the reason why my real father wasn't there. The pain I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I could hardly breathe, and for an instant the world seemed to stop. How was it possible that everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, was a lie? That man, my neighbor, who had been like an uncle, almost like a father to me, had just torn down everything I believed I knew. The words echoed in my mind. "Your father took his own life, and it was because of me." I couldn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it. Over the years I grew up without my father. My mother had always painted a clear picture. He had left because he couldn't handle the responsibility of raising me. "He left when you were very young," she repeated every time I asked questions. She told me he didn't have the strength to face family life and had preferred to disappear. I had accepted that version even though it hurt. I had lived with the idea that my father didn't love me enough to stay. It was painful, yes, but it was a truth I had learned to live with. Or so I thought. But that night, everything changed. My neighbor, that man I trusted implicitly, revealed the truth. My father hadn't run away. He hadn't been incapable of being a father. He had taken his own life because the betrayal of the two people he loved most had destroyed him completely. The man sitting in front of me no longer seemed like the same person. There was something dark in his eyes, a deep sadness, as if he had been carrying that guilt for years. I felt a mixture of rage, pain, and confusion. I wanted to scream at him, ask for explanations, understand how he could have done something so horrible. But at the same time, I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. The words just wouldn't come out of my mouth. My mind was flooded with images of my father, a man I never knew, facing a desperation so deep that it led him to take his own life. And all because of the two people I trusted most. At that moment, I began to remember things, small details I had ignored over the years. I remembered the times I saw my mother and my neighbor talking quietly in the kitchen, sharing laughs that always seemed too intimate. I remembered how, when I was a child, my mother would get nervous when my neighbor came to the house if I was present, as if there was something she didn't want me to see. For years I had ignored those signs, believing they were just friendly interactions between two adults who had known each other for a lifetime. But now, seeing the truth laid bare before me, all those scenes took on a new meaning, a much more sinister and devastating one. He kept talking, trying to justify his actions, saying they hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that what happened was a mistake, that he regretted it too. But his words were like knives. How could he justify what he had done? How could he look me in the eye after destroying my family, after taking my father away from me without me even knowing? Every word he said only fueled the fury growing inside me. I wanted him to stop talking. I wanted him to disappear from my life. I wanted everything to go back to the way it was before, when I didn't know the truth. But there was no turning back. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair I had been sitting in, and ran out of the kitchen. I could barely see through the tears welling up in my eyes. I felt like my heart was going to explode in my chest. I ran to my room and slammed the door shut. I collapsed on the floor, unable to contain the sobs that poured out of me like a broken dam. Everything I had known, everything I had believed, had turned out to be a lie. The man who had raised me in place of my father, the one I had trusted so much, had taken away my only chance of knowing my real father. My mother didn't come home until late that night, when I was already exhausted from crying. I heard her come in, probably surprised to find the house in complete silence. She must have noticed the bottle of wine on the table and the chair knocked over on the floor, but she didn't say anything. I stayed in my room with the door closed, pretending to be asleep. I didn't have the strength to face her, to ask her if what my neighbor had told me was true. Part of me still wanted to hold on to the idea that it was all a lie, that my mother wouldn't have done something so horrible. But deep down, I knew it was all true. In the following days, I barely spoke to my mother. I shut myself off, isolating myself from the world. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mixture of anger and betrayal that I couldn't control. She, the person I loved most in the world, had been complicit in the destruction of our family. She had lied to me for all those years, hiding the truth about my father. And the worst part was that she had done it to protect herself, not to protect me. Finally, after a week of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. One night while she was in the kitchen, I gathered my courage and asked her directly. No beating around the bush, no evasions. I just wanted the truth. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice cracking with pain. "Is it true what he told me?" My mother froze. I could see the blood drain from her face as if she hadn't expected me to know the truth. There was a long silence where the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Finally, with tears in her eyes, she nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, unable to look me in the eye. "I didn't want you to find out like this." The confession felt like a slap. I couldn't believe it. I had spent my entire life believing a lie, and in that moment, my world completely collapsed. I didn't know whether to scream at her or cry, whether to run away or stay there. I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions that tore me apart inside. Everything I knew, everything I believed, had been a farce, and the two people I trusted most had betrayed me in the most cruel way imaginable. In the days that followed, things didn't get better. Although my mother tried to explain herself, to justify her actions, I could never forgive her for what she did. How could I? She had robbed me of the chance to know my father, to have a life with him. She had allowed the man partly responsible for his death to raise me. And even though my neighbor tried to apologize, our interactions became unbearable. I couldn't look him in the eye without feeling a deep, visceral hatred. The man who had been like a father to me had become someone I despised. Finally, shortly after my 18th birthday, I decided to leave home. I couldn't keep living in that environment, couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when every day the pain consumed me more and more. I moved into a small apartment in the city, far away from them, far away from the memories that tormented me. To this day, I can't forgive them. Neither my neighbor, with whom I once had a beautiful relationship, nor my mother, who lied to me my entire life. Betrayal is a wound that will never fully heal. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how my life would have been if my father had lived. If I had known the truth from the beginning, maybe things would have been different. Maybe. But it's too late for maybes. What hurts the most isn't just the loss of my father, but the fact that he was taken from me without me knowing, without giving me the chance to understand or say goodbye.